was no one like you. You would rip apart the clouds in all my days. Others all fade away.
Good morning to everybody in Western Australia, and good afternoon to all of you supporters that are located elsewhere. It's great to have you with us this morning or this afternoon. And I hope you enjoyed that beautiful video. I'm inspired by it every time I see it. It's a great snapshot of the wonderful work that's happening around Australia and that's made possible by our supporters like yourselves. My name is Luke Bayley. I'm speaking to you from Geraldton, which is on the country of the Nugginja, Willenyu and Amangu people of the Southern Yamatji Nation. So I'm the Executive Manager for South Australia and Western Australia, and it's wonderful to be hosting this webinar today. I've hosted a few of these webinars over the past few months, given that we haven't been able to get out and about as much as we usually do, and it's been wonderful to see Bush Heritage be able to stay connected to our supporters using technology like this to share the great work that is happening all over the country and that many of you would be well aware of in the spring appeal that's recently been released. It's a great topic today, the Fitzsterlings, and there's going to be lots of interest, I'm sure, from you all around Australia. Last night we had up to 137 registrations from around the country, so that's a fantastic response. The purpose of today's webinar is to just connect with our supporters, which I've already mentioned, and to provide more information about the Fitzsterling program. We've been working in this amazing part of southern Western Australia for near on 15 years, but there's been considerable work before that, and Angela's been involved in the Gondwana link concept and in conservation down in that biodiversity hotspot for many years. So you're in really good hands with Angela and Chontarle today. That leads me to introduce you to our first speaker, which is Chontarle Bellottie. She's also in the Geraldton office, just down the hallway from myself. Chontarle's been with Bush Heritage Australia for 3.5 years. She's got an extensive background in nature, tourism, interpretation, and Aboriginal land management, and also health and education. So we're really excited and proud to have Chontarle as part of our team. Her role currently is to support our Aboriginal engagement across the Midwest of Western Australia. So that includes our Charles Darwin reserves, our Urardi and Hamlin, and working with traditional owners and our reserve staff to improve how we operate with traditional owners. And also down in the South Coast, which is where she's going to be talking to you today about Noongar country and our work that has been happening down that way. But Chontarle's also been instrumental in developing several key organisational policies and procedures, which is helping Bush Heritage to become a more culturally competent organisation. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Chontarle, and she's going to share with you a presentation and talks about the cultural layers of the landscape. These layers that are really unfolding for Bush Heritage and have been over the past decade and are a really important part of how we do business now. And we're really proud to be able to share this insight with you today. So over to you, Chontarle.
Wanju Wanju, everyone, which in Nyungar is welcome. So Wanju Wanju kai yok maman nangi Chontarle, nangi European nini nija, what amangu Willinyu Nagaja Buja Karajan Wat Kulon. So what I've just said is I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners in which the country I'm sitting on right now, which is the Willinyu, Amangu and Ngadjati people from Geraldton, so the Southern Yamatji group. I'd also like to acknowledge those Aboriginal people that are present in this webinar today. The country we're referring to, and that I'm going to speak from my court, so from my heart, is from Ganang Buja. So Buja meaning land in Nyungar language, and with connections across the Menang and Williman countries along in the Nyungar nation. My name is Chontarle Bellottie, and I'm a Wurundjeri traditional owner from the southwest, of Western Australia. I am here today representing Bush Heritage in my role as Aboriginal Partnerships Manager in Aboriginal engagement for the West. We're very fortunate that Bush Heritage holds a deep respect and values the traditional owners of this continent. The landscapes of the Stirling Range and the Fitzstirling on Nyungar country in the southwest of West Australia are found in one of the most ecologically and culturally diverse on the planet. Our old people have taught us the importance of cultural knowledge to care for and to protect all living things. There is this oneness, a connectedness to all life. And we as traditional owners have a responsibility to continue our cultural obligations. It is also very important to realise and to recognise the impact of government policies that have led to broad-scale land clearing for agriculture and that had sought to control our lives as traditional owners, resulting in a vast change to traditional land use systems, cultural, social, economic ways of life, which of course has changed the way we conserve country today. Although the past political, social, economic impacts were devastating for Nyungar people, there remains a sense of place, a sense of belonging and knowing among our families. Our history, our connection to the Buja, like our land, again Buja, has shaped our identity. The Buja sings, it tells us our stories, it whispers the language. We know our dreaming, we know our songlines. These songlines carry our language, our law, our karajan. Karajan is our knowledge. Every living thing for us in our country is connected through song, story, dance and art. Now, for everyone listening today, I would love for you to participate in this through the chat box. The photo on the screen is of one part of Nyungar country. It's actually on Ganang country. And I'm wondering, can you describe in the chat box for me what you can see? Is there something that really stands out for you? Maybe if you were there, what could you hear? What can you smell? And I'll just read through the chat box while you type away. Is there something that really stands out to you in this picture? It's such a beautiful picture of one of the parts. I love it. We've got the babbling of water. So it's a bit like the description of what you can see and if you were there, what you could hear. The tweeting of birds. I'm just reading through the chat box. A flowing creek. Absolutely. Keep them coming. Untouched nature. Beautiful. Life. Something that we've just spoken about, that connectedness. A lush country, green with flowing water. The peace of trees. It is beautiful when you're out on country in the bush, isn't it? I'm a real saltwater person, so I like the sound of big crashing waves. Wind rustling and whistling trees, love it. The rocks and the ancient. Keep them coming, and as you do, I'm just going to say what I see. And what I see is a cultural landscape. And all of those things that you see, we see the cultural landscape as our conservation over 60,000 years have shaped the landscape to what it is today. I also see in that spring, I can see our babies being washed, our babies being nurtured. I can see our people drinking from that water. I can see grinding stones. I can see bush medicine. I can see bush foods. I can smell that medicine, those tea tree. It's funny, we buy tea tree today from the shop. I can see even lizard traps. I can see everything that is a cultural landscape for us today. The one thing though, if I was there, I can certainly feel the wind on my skin and hear our ancestors whisper through the sway of the she oaks. They do say that our people talk in that sound of the she oaks. So next time you're sitting under a she oak, have a listen. I hear the songs of the birds telling us that rain may be coming. In the photo in front of you, you can see the purple-crowned lorikeet, one of my favourites. In language, it's called Kara. A place called Coram up in the southwest is from the name Kara. It's a message maybe from Monjebup. Monjebup is our totem. So our totemic animal telling us what's the best time of year to pick the quandong, or what we call the walgu. There are many indicators in a cultural landscape showing us the right time of year to gather, to hunt, to cultivate, to bath our babies, to carry our food for our existence, to take only what we need to sustain life and all of life. I'm just wondering, I love that you're writing, and I love everything you guys have put in there. And I was just wondering, do you have a connection to a place? Maybe a place that's very special to you, special to your court, special to your heart. Is there a plant or an animal that might be special for you? Our next speaker, I know she holds those little honey possums in that right-hand corner of your screen. They are beautiful. Our knowledge through our Durida, our totems, our totemic relationship with country is unique. We carry our Durida Katajan, so our totem knowledge, like walking encyclopedias, but for those young ones, walking Google, okay? I might just have a look if anyone's written, just quick before we move on to this one. Sorry, I'm just going to open my chat box because I can't get to it as soon as everyone else can. Oh, no one's written what their favourite places are. Is there any favourite plants or animals? I'd love to hear from you. I love it. So we've got a kookaburra. Wonderful. Canyons. Ooh, I don't know if that's a language or a place. As Coolum is a place, I know that, but shows that I'm not too sure. I'm thinking that's Queensland. The creeks, platypus, oh, they're amazing. Melaleucas, as I described, a beautiful tea tree. Numbats, I love drawing numbats. They are absolute favourite. The sound, oh, this is interesting. The sound of coal signals the spring. Ningen the echidna. Seagrass, aren't seagrass amazing? Funny enough, someone's mentioned carnabis. So I will mention that on the screen, you can see there are a couple of these carnabis. So the carnaby, what we also know as ngulak. Ngulak is the carnabis cockatoo, one of my favourites. So the carnabis cockatoo and karak, which is a red-tailed cockatoo. In my family story, the two are brothers. The most important part of our dreaming story is to realise that these two brothers, even though you can't see karak on the screen, but ngulak and karak, they both represent a council of old man elders, and they would always ensure a supply of food for all families and that there is happiness and laughter for young and old. I love that story. I guess the thing that we remember when we do our work in community is that the tireless work of our Nyungar elders and community over decades to help lift people out of poverty have enabled Nyungar people to participate and celebrate our culture, which is of critical importance to our families. For example, access to country, to continue cultural burning practices, to sharing the katajan, sharing the knowledge with the younger generations. This struggle with equality and opportunity for Aboriginal people continues across Australia today. I am very proud to work, but also of the work that Bush Heritage and others do. Aboriginal partnerships provide a lasting, significant conservation value across the Australian landscape, as well as contributing towards additional economic, cultural and social benefits for future Aboriginal people and all Australians. Like this stand of red mort eucalypt, in Nyungar, mort means family, and families are about supporting one another, just as Bush Heritage supports community and realises a shared vision of a healthy country protected forever. Remember, there is no disconnect from biodiversity and belonging as a people I hope that you see yourself as part of this family too, because we all belong.
Oh, thank you, Chontarle, for that amazing insight. And from what I can see on the chat room with all of the wonderful supporters that have dialed in there, there's some really special places and animals that all of you are connected to. And I guess that's what brings us together in causes like Bush Heritage. It's a belief that we are part of something, that we want to ensure that these landscapes and these systems and these communities are thriving and healthy as we move forward. That's what we're all doing, and that's what you as our supporters are enabling. So that was wonderful. Thank you. And I'll just remind people that there is the question and answer function. So additional to the chat area, which a lot of people are in at the moment, feel free to ask any questions, and we will try and we will get to some of those questions at the end after we hear from the next presenter, and the ones that we don't get to, we will certainly respond in an email to you all. So as we've heard from Chontarle about the cultural living landscape, the Bush Heritage knows we're part of and learns from and takes that approach across all of our operations. This is not unique to the South Coast program. This is how we do business. This is what we believe in, and this is what we are striving for and working with. We also are deeply rooted in science, and as Angela is going to talk to you about, alchemy. Angela, as I mentioned, has been leading our conservation work down in the South Coast program with Simon Smale, who's recently left us to retire to New Zealand, but she's also joined down there by two other great staff members, Alex Hams, who's our Healthy Landscape Manager, and Jeff Pindar, who's leading a really interesting research program down there on the interaction of feral animals and how we can work with our neighbours and neighbouring landholders to better manage country. And she's deeply committed to the work we do down there, understands the scientific principles and the methods we use, and has had a key role in developing and refining those over the years. So it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Angela down there in beautiful Albany to share her insights on the Fitzsterling program and the conservation science that's happening down there.
Oh, thank you, Luke, and welcome to everyone. And as Luke says, I'm sitting in Menang country on the south coast of Western Australia at the moment, and we've got a beautiful day down here, which is lovely for a change. But okay, so I'm going to outline the work that I've been doing on the south coast here now since the mid-1990s, and I suppose it's culminated in my work with Bush Heritage, restoring farmland back to fauna habitat. So my passion is creating fauna habitat, and I'll explain to you today what the methods we use and some of the results we're getting with the land that we've restored so far. So next slide, please. So to do that, we've been using science, which is, basically it's a systematic study of the physical world through observation and also experiment. So we're doing that in the Fitzsterling, in the work that we do. But there's also, I think, a little bit of alchemy in all that. So seemingly a magical process that, transforms the landscape. And I'll talk more about that as we go through. So the next slide will show you a map of where we're working, and it will show you the south coast of Western Australia, and Bush Heritage has 6 properties out in the area that we call the Fitzsterling, and you'll see this broad scale map. Some of those properties are marked there with the red dots, and the next slide will show you a close-up view of that area that we're working in. So you can see the Stirling Range National Park to the west and the Fitzgerald River National Park to the east. And in the middle, there are lots of different coloured properties, and they're the ones that we're actually working on. So the green areas are all the remnant vegetation. That's the remnant vegetation that's left in that landscape. And unfortunately, the white areas are all cleared of native vegetation. So they're mainly paddocks, and it's a cereal growing area, and also sheep and cattle. So what we're trying to do in this area is reconnect those 2 national parks. So we've been working mainly, as you can see, in the central area, And the bush heritage properties are coloured the orangey brown, and the Greening Australia also own properties out there, and they're coloured dark green. And we also have private conservation reserves that people have purchased specifically for the aim of conservation, and they're shown in yellow. And we have partnerships with 3 of those properties now, which is great, and we're able to help with the management of those properties. So we've been working in this area now since 2002, and we did our first restoration of 65 hectares in 2004 on our Cheraninup Reserve, and the last restoration that we are working this year, doing some infill on Monjebup North of proteaceous species for Carnaby's cockatoo. So we've got an extraordinary level of native plant diversity through that area, as well as creeks and granite outcrops. And we've got unallocated Crown land, we've got private property, we've got nature reserves, and it's all in a mosaic in that landscape. So bush heritage so far has been involved in about 1,300 hectares of restoration in that area. So on the next slide, we will see some of the species that I'm going to talk about now. And one of the big questions for me, working on the South Coast since the mid-1990s, has been how do we restore or improve fauna habitat on cleared country? So I was lucky enough to spend 7 years working in the Fitzgerald River National Park and surroundings. And I got to do a lot of fauna and also a little bit of vegetation work during that time. And I've seen a lot of restored land, and some of it is, we got very good, I guess, at putting in rows of trees. You know, sometimes they were not native eucalypts, eucalypts from other areas of Australia. And these really didn't provide very good fauna habitat at all. So I got to thinking about how can we improve the way we do restoration. So the paddock that you see on the top slide there is our Baringa Reserve before it was restored. And I'm standing there looking, doing a bird survey about 2 years or so before it was restored to collect baseline information. And the area that I'm looking at there provides really good habitat for magpies, willy wagtails, things like Richard's pipits and brown songlarks, occasional galah, maybe kestrels. So you can count on 2 hands the number of species that use that type of habitat. And those species we call agricultural increaser species. So they've increased their range and they've increased their numbers since this land was converted from native vegetation to agricultural land. So the animals like the bush rat, the native bush rat, which is the small mammal there on the right, bottom right slide, they have really suffered during the land clearing, and you just don't find them in the paddock areas at all. So my big question was, how do we improve fauna habitat for some of these species that have decreased across this landscape, which is most of our native fauna? So the next slide, I'll talk about where I started. So I thought where to begin would be to work out what fauna that we could reasonably expect to return to the land after we'd restored it. So I was very familiar with the species, the fauna species that occurred in the native vegetation, in the national parks and in the nature reserves, and very familiar with what occurred on the agricultural land. So I was able to then do a research and examine the resource needs of all those species that needed more specialised resources than what the paddocks were providing. So then after I'd done that, the next step was to determine how to incorporate those resources into the design of the restoration. So as I said, we've been restoring since 2004, and we've been having some success in the early days, but with Monjebup North, we've lifted it to another level. And on the next slide, I'll show you just an example of the reptiles and the shelter elements that they need in the bush to survive in an area. So there's probably around 58 species of reptile that I use for this analysis, and we'd expect most of those to return to the restored areas. So as you can see from that graph, a lot of the different species use litter and rocks, burrows and logs for their shelter and to provide food. So the invertebrates that they eat also shelter under logs, etc. So abandoned stick ant nests came up very, very prominent, and these are quite prominent in the bushland, but not so much in the restoration, although they are recolonising the restoration slowly. And we have less arboreal reptiles in the Fitzsterling. Most of them are ground dwelling. And other ant nests too also provide habitat, especially for things like blind snakes, which live in ant nests pretty well exclusively in our area. So we looked at things like geckos, skinks, snakes, and legless lizards, for instance, and we looked at all the elements that they need to provide habitat for them. And then what I did on the next slide was to distill this down into a summary of all the functional groups, insectivores, carnivores, etc., and the resources that we could provide for each of those functional groups in our restoration. So, for instance, for things like the honey possum, we need to provide flora, we need to provide plant species that will flower all year round, because as we know, honey possums just eat pollen and nectar, and they don't have any teeth, they can't chew insects, and they don't eat them at all. So we had to make sure that the plants we were putting in there would provide flowers 12 months of the year. And that's what we've done on Monjebup North. So we also needed to put plants in that were fairly short-lived, prickly plants for nesting birds, plants that readily shed branches and bark. And we also used, we had to create piles of rocks and soil heaps, etc., because that had all been cleared from the landscape when it was cleared in the early days. So you can see from that there's a fair variety of thinking that we had to do on how we were going to provide all these different resources when we did our restoration. And on the next slide, we can see that what we were working with was bare paddocks. So the top slide shows Monjebup North before it was reseeded, and there's Jack on his machine there with a seeding machine putting the seeds into the ground. So we were able to come up with about 150 species, and that is out of about 932 that we know grow in that area now. We will only be able to collect seed from 150 of those species. So we don't know much about the majority of the species, the plant species out there, and how to get them back into our restored areas. So we did what we could, and Jack would mix up the seed depending on the soil type in which he was sowing the seed. So we had everything from heavy clay right through to light sands on that property, and all the sowing was done to seed type. So we've got 8 different plant communities that we've restored on Monjebup North. And the bottom slide just shows our attempt at doing some microhabitat reconstruction. So there were a lot of rock piles that were created on the clearing of the land. So we redistributed those rocks throughout the landscape, and we also used some of the vegetation that was cleared from a fence line to put in a new fence. We used that vegetation to put within the rocks to provide termite food for reptiles. So we came up with lots of different ways of creating burrowable soil. So just using a grader to scrape off the weed seeds before we put the seeds in, and that provides burrowable soil for the animals that need that loose soil for their survival. As you can imagine, after 50 years of farming, the tractors compact the soil quite heavily, and also sheep and cattle do as well. So we needed to break that up to provide opportunities for roots for plants and also for fauna. So the next slide shows that the monitoring program that we run out there is very comprehensive, and it's vital for us to be able to keep improving what we do. So we not only monitor the vegetation that regrows, we also monitor the fauna species, and we do a little bit of monitoring on invertebrates as well. So we use trapping, and we use camera trapping and various methods. So that central bottom slide there shows us out there fauna trapping the very same year after the seeding was done. So this was a sea of ryegrass basically, and it was before some of the native plants germinated. So we have some really good baseline information on our fauna on Monjebup North. So the next slide, we're looking at the impact of our efforts. So this is only some of the impacts. These are the major impacts. We do have lots of smaller ones, but it would take me a long time to talk through all those. But what we've done is we've extended the extent of native vegetation, and it's acting like mallee heath by just over 2,500 hectares. And we've restored black glove wallaby habitat, so they're coming back into the restored areas now. And we've increased other vertebrate fauna species richness as well. And in fact, the bird activity in our restored areas is now higher than in the control sites in the bushland, and that is to be expected, because the restored areas are really robust and they're dynamic, and they're growing. So and some of the bushland areas are now a lot older, obviously, and not quite as productive. And we found 5 bat species are using the restored sites. And really, really excitingly, we've now got malleefowl present and breeding in 5-year-old vegetation. They've been working a mound on Monjebup North now for 2 years. And Carnaby's cockatoos too, they're feeding in our 6-year-old vegetation. So there's just some of the impacts of our efforts. And the next slide, I will talk about what we have learned. And this is really, really interesting. And as I've said, out of the 934 plant species across those 10,000 hectares where we work, we know how to collect seed from and germinate and sustain less than 20% of them. So it's a big knowledge gap in that area. And it's something that we're trying to encourage researchers to look at the moment. So we can reproduce a canopy pretty easily, mid-story pretty well, lower story not so well, but the ground covers and the forbs and the sedges are the things that elude us. And the ground covers out there are pretty sparse, and we really need those to encourage some of the ground feeding birds and some of those reptiles and mammals back into our systems. And one of the interesting things is we found a sweet spot between about 3,000 and 15,000 stems per hectare, where fauna habitat is the most productive. So under 3,000 stems per hectare, it is fairly sparse, and you just don't get much living in there. Over 15,000 plant stems per hectare, we found is too dense. So the plants will grow, they don't sort themselves out. What they do is they all grow and they lock up and they sit for years at the same stage, and they become diseased, and they also become attacked by different insects. So they don't provide much habitat when they're too dense. I think in the long term they will sort themselves out, but certainly it's taking quite a long time. So we've got some areas out there that have been sitting pretty well stagnant for about 15 years. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. And one of the other things we found is eucalypts rule, and they will grow anywhere we put them. They will grow really well, and that's often to the detriment of some of the other genera of plants out there. So much so that in our next restoration project, we're going to do an experiment where we sow just understory species. So we'll provide mid-story and lower story and as much ground cover as we can. We'll let that grow for a few years, and then we're going to put eucalypts in as seedlings and plant them by hand afterwards. So we're going to try that and see how it goes. So that's another, a really good experiment that I'm looking forward to. So where the alchemy comes in is, I'll talk about the next slide. So what have we learned about the fauna? So despite our best efforts based on good science and goodwill, the fauna habitat that we've created looks very different, to our eyes at least, to the adjacent bushland. So we could call them novel ecosystems. But despite this, the animals are returning. So they're returning. We're obviously providing enough resources for them to survive in these novel ecosystems, but they certainly don't look anything like the bushland. But they have the same similar structure and a few of the same plants, but we've still got a long way to go. And I think this is where the alchemy comes in. We've done our best, we've given it our best shot, and the animals are showing us that, that it's got their tick of approval for most of them. We've still got a few to go. And from what I've witnessed over the past 15 or 20 years, I think there's a bit of magic in all of it too. And we certainly don't know everything, and I don't think we ever will. We just provide the opportunities, and magic seems to happen. Anyway, thank you for listening, and that's it. We've got one more slide to go, and I'd really like to thank all our supporters for helping us with our work, and none of it could be possible without your support. So thank you very much, and I'll pass you back to Luke.
Thank you, Ange. That was, as always, a wonderful insight into the hard work and commitment of you and the broader team across Bush Heritage and our other collaborators in that landscape to restore what is a really precious part of Australia and the world. And I guess it's really important to note that this is something we do collectively. We do it with traditional owners, as Chontarle's highlighted. We also do it with the farming community and other conservation community groups that work in that landscape. And it's really important that we acknowledge that. We've got a few questions coming in, so that's really exciting. So I'm going to do my best to get it through as many questions as we can. So I'll just ask Ange and Shoni to prepare themselves and to, in the essence of trying to make this as engaging as possible, we'll try and keep the answers, as brief but as meaningful as we can. So we'll have some Q&A, then I'll do a wrap up and throw it, and then we'll all be able to get on with our day and hopefully feeling somewhat inspired about all the wonderful work that's happening, not just in this project, but across all of Bush Heritage's partnerships and reserves. So there's a question here from Jennifer, and it's a pretty simple one, and I'll just answer it. It's about, are we planning to buy more properties in the Stirling and Fitzgerald National Park? Absolutely, we want to buy more properties. But we also are looking at creative ways of partnering with people who hold land within that region as well, because some properties we're never going to be able to purchase, and we need to look at how we can support the farming community or other private landholders or traditional owners to embrace conservation and to build on the lessons that traditional owners have shared with us and that we as scientists have gleaned as per Ange's presentation. So definitely going to be buying more land and influencing more land across this amazing landscape. All right, the next question is here. Ange, this one might be for you. Do bats, and this is from Elaine, do bats need trees or caves for their habitat?
In our part of the world, they use trees. So they use underbark and in crevices, etc. There are a few caves, but there are only a couple of species that use those caves. Most of them are in trees, underbark.
Right. And while we're talking about trees, there's another question here about the word stems that you used in the reference to the restoration work. So can you just clarify what you mean by that term?
Yeah, a stem is a plant. So we go and we count all the plants in a quadrat, in all the separate plants, and that's called a stem. It's just a metric that we use to measure, I suppose, the coverage of the plants across the landscape.
No worries. And I was looking for a question that came in from Shannon earlier, and I realised it disappeared on me, and I'm like, oh no, that's an amazing question. But I found it in the answered question, but maybe not everyone's realised. So, and this is, Shani, something for you. And Shannon was asking how, on the back of your speech talking about the living cultural landscape, how we can encourage more people to create these connections with the landscape and with nature, and I also, I guess, with traditional owners as well. So would you mind just touching on that question?
Sure. Thanks, Shannon. I did say great question. Often local environmental groups and Aboriginal NRM groups and others offer opportunities to get involved with on-country events, programs, trips. A good example is here in Geraldton, we have a local wildflower group that does our Chapman Valley walk along the Chapman River. And I think that it's important to spend the time out in country with various different people and get involved. I think, you know, one of the best, what I love about Bush Heritage is our volunteers, and our volunteers, they come with the passion and drive and wanting to spend time and see a change in country and that they're making a change in not only conserving and protecting it, but also rehabilitation, like what Ange has just run through. Is quite an incredible, I guess, it's an incredible feat, because you know, we've seen a country that has just, but through government policy, has just been wiped and cleared, and to see the regeneration and to bring back species that belong to that country. And for us, it's a revitalisation of culture. And also just to remember to be kind to one another and all living things.
Okay, I'm going to add something to that, but you're both going to have one question, so have a think about this, and it's about what has been your biggest surprise. And you obviously in reference to the conservation and partnership work we're doing. So have a think about that. And I think the other element of your question, Shannon, for me, is we need to recognise that people connect variously with landscapes, and some of them are connecting through the science lens, which is amazing because it gives knowledge and it builds on itself, and then others are connecting through being there and stories or experiences that they may have had or will have on our reserves or in nature with their families and loved ones. So I think it's about getting that rounded experience of what we do in managing one country and bringing it back to good health, is recognising that science underpins decision making, but there's also other important elements to why people want to look after country, and as an organisation we need to provide those opportunities, which is what we're doing, which is really heartening. So to round it out, I'm just going to throw to our amazing guest speakers and amazing team members. And what's one of the things that surprised you most in the work you've been doing down in the Fitzsterling?
Oh, the biggest surprise has been how fast the animals come back into a restored area. It's been really amazing in that, you know, within 3 years, we've got honey possums back into some of these areas, and the plants that, you know, no bigger than a metre tall. And they're already in there breeding, so they're getting enough to eat. And also things like malleefowl come in really quickly, and brush wallabies. So it's just been the speed, I guess, in which, you know, animals will, you know, come back after you. As soon as you start providing the resources for them, they'll come straight back in. So, yeah, that's my biggest surprise.
Oh, yeah, it's so positive. And just before I let you go, there was a frog in one of your slides. What sort of frog was that, and can you do the call?
Oh, yeah, I can. That was a turtle frog that lives totally underground, and they don't need water to breed. And I can do their call because I heard one the other day. They go, rah, and that's about it. Awesome. Not very spectacular.
Well, that was good. Well done. That's a great effort. I hope the 80-odd people out there across Australia, our supporters, enjoyed that rendition. And I certainly did. So, Shani, in Geraldton here, what's one of the things that surprised you about your work in this program, or more generally in Bush Heritage?
I think I feel very fortunate that being a new employee of Bush Heritage over the last 3 years, but the work that has been done in the Southwest, it's been done with so much hard work and love. And I think I'll never forget the first time that I went out to some of the Fitzsterling reserves, and on one side I'm standing on agricultural, really important farming land. However, on the other side, I'm standing in this rehabilitated, amazing biodiverse country with mulak and karak and ngao, the mallee fowl, and all of these, and Anne showing me the nesting boxes. I mean, it's just incredible. And life, I think these living, we're just so lucky to have to do the work that we do because of our supporters, and to work side by side with traditional owners, which is, for me, it's not a surprise as such. It's more of a what's next, and working with the traditional owners in right way science, which is our two-way science. So ensuring that the knowledge of the 60,000-year-old knowledge is balanced with the work that we do with science on the ground, and the magic happens.
Great. Well, what a great couple of reflections to end on. And I just would like to reiterate that all of this is only possible because of the supporters like yourselves, and that's supporters in a very broad sense, and people give in a variety of ways to make all this work happen, and obviously there's many of them that aren't on this phone call. So thank you for your interest and commitment. It means a lot for us to be able to connect even in this way with you, and to know that you're engaged and you're listening and learning more about the work that all of our Bush Heritage team are doing across the country. The questions that we haven't got, we will certainly type up and we will send out to you, because we're really interested in the dialogue. It's really important to us that our supporters know what's happening and are able to deepen their understanding of the important culture and conservation work that's happening. And it's also been recorded too. So we'll do a bit of editing. We'll certainly make sure the frog call that Ange did is enhanced and is prominent. So you'll be able to see a recording of this too, which will be great. And I just want to thank Ange and Shoni and all of the team, and Anna, for doing this. It doesn't happen that easily. It's coordinating people across states and getting all the technology to work, and getting in from the bush and out in front of computers. It takes a fair level of logistics. So thank you, Anna, and your team, for your help you've given. And I just want to reiterate that Bush Heritage are here to healthy country protected forever. And as Shoni mentioned, I think that element of biodiversity and belonging is a really nice thing to take away from today's presentation. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to connecting with you on our next webinar, or there's a few other webinars also that you should really check out. So have a great afternoon, and we'll speak again soon.